Welcome to the State of Democracy lecture. It's the second in the series this year. I'm Grant Reher, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, and Roger Hardy's visit marks the beginning of the British invasion in this series. Next semester, we'll be hosting John Trickett, a member of Parliament, and Justin Webb, a television and radio reporter and host for the BBC. I have some quick thank yous and introductions to make, and then I'm going to depart the stage. First, thanks to the Dean's Office for supporting the series, and for technical support, the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular, Tom Fazio. I also want to thank my colleague, Elizabeth Cohen, who helps organize the series, and Bethany Wallowender and Kelly Coleman, who work in the Institute and help put together this event. This afternoon, we're back to our traditional format of a lecture, followed by two brief faculty responses, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments, and after that, we'll have a nice reception out in the hallway here, where you'll get a chance to speak with Roger and have him sign his book if you like. First, the two panelists. Mirzad Bourjerdi is Associate Professor of Political Science here at the Maxwell School, where he also serves as the founding director of the Middle Eastern Studies Program and founding co-director of the Religion, Media, and International Relations Program. Bill Banks is Board of Advisors, Distinguished Professor of Law and Professor of Public Administration at the Law School and the Maxwell School, respectively. He's also the director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism. Our guest, Roger Hardy, is, well, you're the only one up here who's not a director, which I suspect, Roger, that may be a good thing for you. He spent 24 years as a Middle East and Islamic affairs analyst for BBC World Service. He's the author of The Muslim Revolt, A Journey Through Political Islam, which I highly recommend. He wrote that book while being a visiting scholar at Princeton University, and he's now a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., where he's working on a project concerning the topic of his remarks this afternoon. So, Roger, welcome to Maxwell. Turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Grant, and thanks, Syracuse, for inviting me. I always used to say Syracuse, but now I've been taught that you guys are Syracuse, and, well, thank you for inviting me here. It's great. The train ride up in weather like this, the train ride up from New York was just fantastic. So I'm happy to be here. And if you're thinking about the game, don't worry. I'll be done long before the game begins. Such is the impeccable timing of Grant and his colleagues that I stand before you today just a couple of days after President Obama was in Indonesia on what you could call the latest stage of his efforts at outreach to the Muslim world. The policy of the administration, I've had the chance in Washington to talk to them about it. I went to the press briefing ahead of his Asia tour. The policy is not engagement only to the Muslim world. It's engagement to everybody, friends and foes, but within that broader policy, engagement to Muslim communities, as the administration likes to put it, is very, very important. And it's very personal for this president. If you look at the speeches he's made, 4 big speeches that have either focused on this or touched on this, he started this on day 1 in the inaugural. There's a section on multiculturalism and there's a section on Muslims, and he used then the phrase he's returned to again and again: mutual respect and mutual interest. The core, the nub of the Obama message to the Muslim world is that he wants, the core, I think, is very simple and very clear. He wants a relationship that's not narrowly defined by terrorism, that stresses commonality, not difference. The phrases mutual interest, common ground, resonate through these speeches. And third, the phrase I've used, a relationship based on mutual interest and mutual respect. You might want to think for a moment about those phrases. It's a very nicely balanced phrase. They're not the same thing, but I think there's a kind of relationship between them. I guess, like many people, I have, or I like to think I have, a stake in Barack Obama. Okay, a modest stake, but when I was in Princeton in 2008, writing the book on Islam, which Grant mentioned and which you're all going to buy, and I'm going to sign, I watched Barack Obama get elected. My favorite bumper sticker, tell me now if maybe this was a New Jersey thing, I have no idea. It was OWWFO. Did you come across this one? Old white woman for Obama. Believe me, in my country, we do not have bumper stickers remotely like that. For me, as a visitor who'd never seen an American election up close, that election taught me a lot about America. You could feel the sense of hope among people who knew that something had gone wrong and had to be put right. And I think that that something wasn't just the economy. Sure, it was the economy. But it wasn't just the economy. I think Americans who followed what was going on in the rest of the world, you're out there somewhere, I just wish there were more of you. I think Americans who are conscious of what the world thinks of America and try to follow what's going on in the world knew that their country had sunk to a new low, not only in the Middle East, but just about everywhere. My title today is Islam and the West, the Challenge for Barack Obama. I use, as a journalist, I'm in the simplification business. I use the term Islam and the West with some misgivings, but I use it as a shorthand. I try not to use it in the Samuel Huntington sense, us and them, a clash of civilizations. I do not subscribe to Huntington's thesis. But what I mean by Islam and the West, what I mean by the shorthand, is that whole bundle of issues and relationships and interests that matter a good deal to Muslims around the world and that matter very much to Western governments and societies. That's what I mean by it. I'm conscious that I have these two wise men who are going to comment as academicians on what I'm saying as a mere journalist. Why, briefly, does the Muslim world, let's call it that again for working purposes, why does it matter to the West? Well, for one thing, it now comprises close to a quarter of humankind. It matters because it's part of the globe with which we in the West have a long history, close ties, and vital strategic interests. It matters because it has a big and growing diaspora in Europe and North America, by which I mean the millions of Muslims who now live in our midst, at least one or two of whom I can see in the audience today. And last but not least, in my judgment, it's a part of the world that in many ways we just don't understand. What am I going to try and do in the next half an hour or so? Well, first, to look at President Obama's new approach to the Muslim world and its problems and ask what's new about it, and then add a kind of commentary of my own on partly the nature of the problems of the Muslim world, what is it that we're grappling with, but also the West's response to those problems. I won't say very much about Europe. You can ask me about it. There's plenty to say. The West does mean principally America in what I'm now going to say. The president's inheritance, the foreign policy legacy he inherited when he entered the White House, can best be described as toxic. In the greater Middle East, he faced maybe the worst set of challenges of any incoming president: a languishing Middle East peace process, 2 difficult and unpopular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, an undefeated Al-Qaeda, a defiant Iran, and hanging like a cloud over everything, that loss of credibility, of moral authority that I referred to a moment ago. America was held in low esteem. Its allies were dispirited. Its enemies were on a roll. It was, as The Economist put it the other day, the inbox from hell. But rather than ducking the challenges, particularly these challenges in the greater Middle East, Barack Obama did, I think, 4 important things early on, more or less from day one. First, he made a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a top priority and called the conflict, and General Petraeus used the same phrase, a strategic threat to American interests. Second, he reached out to hostile states, or more or less hostile states, that the Bush administration had shunned, such as Iran and Syria. Third, in the fight against Al-Qaeda and its allies, he removed the term war on terror, or global war on terror, the GWOT, the G-W-O-T, from official discourse. He banned torture, including waterboarding, and he vowed to close down the prison at Guantanamo Bay. Fourth, and many of you will remember the Cairo speech. Of all these speeches that I've mentioned, Cairo was the big one. Cairo speech in June last year, he brought together all these themes I've mentioned, and more besides, into a kind of framework. He personally engaged the Muslim world. He went there and personally engaged with an Arab audience in the biggest Arab country, Egypt. He sought to address the grievances of Muslims and committed himself to upholding the rights of everybody in a tolerant, multicultural world. And he did that with more credibility because of his own multicultural background. It was, I think, in every sense, a moment of great promise. But in the months that followed the Cairo speech, there was a growing sense of disappointment. A feeling that, in the words of 2 experts in Washington, Mark Lynch and Kristen Lord, President Obama had, quote, overpromised and underdelivered. For those of you who want to follow this, who are not satisfied with this journalistic skating over the surface that you're going to hear from me today, go to the report produced just a few months ago by Mark Lynch and Kristen Lord. It's called America's Extended Hand, Assessing the Obama Administration's Global Engagement Strategy. It was published by the Center for a New American Security, that's CNAS, and you can find it for no money whatsoever at cnas.com. If you're serious about this issue, go there. For one thing, they talk about things I'm not going to talk about at all. They look at why the administration has overpromised and underdelivered. And among the problems they identify are things like bureaucratic issues, but important bureaucratic issues, money, funding of this strategy, the leadership, who's in charge, and what you could call bureaucratic coordination, what they call in Washington the interagency process. There's a tricky concept in American politics. I'm not going to touch on these. I want to talk about the policy aspect of this, because there's no disentangling the policy from the message, the policy from the projection of the policies. On a number of crucial policy areas, the president's strategy of engagement has quite simply stalled. One of the most important of these was that he early on stated his opposition to Israeli settlement building. And yet, apart from a partial freeze, the Israelis have gone on building. The peace talks with the Palestinians are essentially in limbo. Engagement with Iran, although not officially abandoned, I think there are likely to be talks in either Turkey or a European capital in the next couple of weeks. But basically, engagement with Iran has yielded very little. And Iran policy, in the words of one of the most impressive Iranian-American experts, Farideh Fahi, the Obama policy on Iran is now essentially in the hands of the US Treasury. In other words, engagement has given way to sanctions. Guantanamo remains open. His guys came to him and said, we can't do it. He'd not only made a promise, he set a deadline, and he was unable to meet it. And the fate of the remaining detainees is still a hotly debated subject. By the way, let me add, the abuses in Guantanamo have ended. That's important. The abuses have ended and the conditions are much better. Even when he fulfilled a promise, it didn't do him much good. Think about Iraq. He said, and he said it in Cairo, June last year, he said, I will withdraw US combat troops from Iraq by the end of August 2009. He did. Did he get any thanks, for example, from the American voters in the run-up to the midterm elections? No. Did he get any thanks from the people in the Middle East or from the people of Iraq? No. I'm not sure I have time to go into why I think this is so. If you want to ask me why, I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A. He fulfilled a promise and got virtually nothing for his pains. To make matters worse, the president's task abroad has been complicated by an upsurge of Islamophobia at home. You all know what I'm talking about, I think. In the run-up to this year's anniversary of 9/11, passions were aroused by a whole bundle of things. The proposed Islamic Center in Manhattan, by Pastor Jones and his threat to burn the Quran, and things were not helped by the fact that opinion polls showed that apparently a great many Americans harbor the view that the president is actually a Muslim. The sense of disappointment with President Obama's first 2 years is understandable. I share some of it. But I think that if he has not accomplished more, that's only partly his fault, only partly the fault of his administration. He can't walk on water. When he made the inaugural speech, many of us thought he could walk on water. Well, lo and behold, he can't. He's mortal. He's fallible. Intelligent, good, charming, and all those other things, but human and fallible, just like everybody else on this planet. But beyond that, and this is where I want to go now for at least a couple of minutes, these issues that I've talked about and other related issues I've not talked about are complex. They have deep roots. Let me say a little bit about where I think those roots lie. Since I've written a book that is very much about this, if you want the fuller version, well, you know where to go. That's the last plug for the book, by the way. There are no more plugs. In the words of one of America's most seasoned diplomats, we in the West have yet to learn that, quote, imposing ourselves on hostile or chaotic societies is no solution. This is Ryan Crocker, Ambassador Crocker, writing in Newsweek. And he went on, the perceived arrogance and ignorance of overbearing powers can create new narratives of humiliation that will feed calls for vengeance centuries from now. End of quote. Narratives of humiliation. I want to talk now about one major factor behind Muslim anger which often is not violent, but anger which in some cases leads to violence and suicide bombings. There are many others. I am going to focus on one that seems to me crucial. In my view, those narratives of humiliation, personal and collective humiliation, provide a key, one of the keys, but an important key to understanding the anger and frustration that leads young men, and it's usually young men, to become suicide bombers. The idea of Muslim humiliation at the hands of the West is at the heart of the message of Al-Qaeda and groups of the Al-Qaeda type. Some people say Al-Qaeda is bankrupt. Very respectable people, experts. They say that Al-Qaeda has lost the war of ideas, period. I'm sorry, but I don't share that view. Radical Islamism, to my mind, feeds on failure. And that's why it still has a shelf life. That's why the story is not over. It feeds, first of all, on the failures of the regimes in the Muslim world, which are for the most part corrupt and autocratic and are for the most part our allies. Their failings become our failings. And secondly, they feed on our failings, those that we do all by ourselves. The West's failings. Instead of undermining the jihadist narrative, which every Western politician says that they want to do, all too often we've unwittingly reinforced and even legitimated the jihadist narrative. Think about it. The jihadists said we were brutal, neo-colonial powers intent on oppressing and humiliating Muslims. And what did we do? We invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. We gave them Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. The invasion of Afghanistan was at least understandable. It was Al-Qaeda's safe haven. Invading Iraq, I think now most people agree, even those who were for the war, even many of those who were for the war at the time. I think most people now agree it was a mistake. You see my talent for English understatement? A mistake for which we and the Iraqi people and the people of the Middle East are paying a high price. President Obama was surely right to call for mutual respect. And if I can put it this way, it's tricky, but he was morally right as well as politically right. And they're not the same. That's what I think. But if we call for respect, we have to show it. And part of our problem, and part of Barack Obama's problem, is that when he goes out to the Muslim world to show respect, meanwhile, Pastor Jones and Newt Gingrich, and let me add, as a Brit and a European, their counterparts in Europe and elsewhere in the world are showing disrespect, a flagrant, public, much publicized disrespect. And who do we think that alienated Muslims will believe? Do we think alienated Muslims will readily believe, thousands of miles away, that Pastor Jones is just a crank? He's a nobody with a flock that you can count on maybe 4 hands? Why would they believe that in the situation that they're in the psychological situation that they're in? Let me suggest, I'm going to take some water here. Now I'm doing something I could not do as a BBC guy. I'm telling you what I think in unvarnished language. A year ago, I would have given you part of this speech and not the whole speech. I'm a free man now. I like it. Though I do have my wife in the front row here, who's my toughest critic. So freedom is always constrained. Never forget this. Freedom is not unconstrained. Let me suggest 3 ways we can show respect. We, you here, me, and our leaders. Everybody is in this. This is not a normal foreign policy issue. This is about the future of our societies and how we relate to others. How we relate to others over there and others in our midst. It's a very American story. It's a very American story. 3 ways, 3 modest or immodest proposals from me. 1, either speak out consistently for democracy and human rights, or stay silent. Don't call for these things when it comes to Iran, but not for Egypt. Don't call for these things for Burma, and not for Saudi Arabia. There's a word for that, and it's an unpleasant word, and that word is hypocrisy. We know that. And do we think Muslims do not know that? The double standards is a polite way of putting it. It's hypocrisy. If we can't do it consistently, don't do it at all. That's my not so humble opinion. 2, help fight poverty and illiteracy and underdevelopment. They may not be, and experts tend now not to see them as the main causes of extremism, but they're sure as hell part of the backdrop to extremism. Rich countries, not only this country, can do more to promote, for example, education in countries we worry about, such as Pakistan. 3, shut down the factories of terrorism. What am I talking about? Some of you will have heard Robert Pape from Chicago University. I watched him on C-SPAN the other day. He argued in an earlier book that he wrote, and he argues again in a new book that he's co-authored, Cutting the Fuse. I can't remember the subtitle, but a book about the causes of extremism, Cutting the Fuse. Pape has argued that occupation of someone else's land is the single biggest driver of extremism and political violence on our planet. Wow. Examples? You don't have to look very far. That means Iraq and Afghanistan, where we are the occupiers. America, Britain, and the Dutch and the Germans, or whoever it may be, the West. It means Kashmir, Chechnya, southern Thailand, where I went once on the most mysterious of all my journeys for the BBC, the southern Philippines, and above all, the Palestinian territories, all places where other people are the occupiers, and those other people are usually our allies. Professor Pape is onto something. It does not mean that there are no other factors going on. Ideological brainwashing of lost kids who don't know who they are anymore, all these other things that are written about very much. But occupation is something that I think a lot of people can understand. In all these places I've mentioned, and others I haven't mentioned, occupation is deeply resented, and resistance to occupation is increasingly expressed in the language of religion. The single most important of these conflicts, what I call these factories of terrorism, is the Palestinian problem. Don't believe it when people tell you that bin Laden doesn't care about the Palestinian problem, or that he tacked it on belatedly and opportunistically to his laundry list of grievances. Palestine is at the core of the global jihad. In the words of Bruce Riedel, one of the foremost experts on all these things in Washington, it's Al-Qaeda's, I quote, central, all-consuming issue. In other words, of all the bits of occupied land, this, because of Jerusalem, is special. Solving the Palestinian problem would not end the jihad, but it would deprive the jihadists of oxygen. It would undermine their narrative. It would make it, even to some degree, harder for them to recruit gullible young people. These regional conflicts, and they are many, are factories of terrorism, and our challenge is to shut them down. Doing so is not an act of altruism. It is in our interest. It occurred to me while writing these words that maybe mutual respect and mutual interest are, after all, mutually reinforcing. I want to say one other thing, and I want to give you as much time to question me, interrogate me, cross-examine me, or ask me why I'm wearing such a peculiar tie, as you wish to do. Remember I quoted Ryan Crocker's remarks just now? Ambassador Crocker's remarks are a call for difficult things, for patience, understanding, humility. I think Barack Obama has all of those things. And I think he will deploy them as he confronts the challenges ahead of him. Don't write him off just yet. I'm not an expert on your politics, and I would never claim to be, but I sit in a very interesting place in Washington, and I talk to a hell of a lot of people who are. Yes, the midterm elections hurt him and his party, as everyone knew they would. But the savvy folk in Washington tell me his chances of getting re-elected in 2012 are still pretty good. Right now, he's the favorite. Now, 2012 is some way away. A prime minister in my country, when I was very tiny, said, "A week is a long time in politics." Okay, of course things may change between now and then, but it's worth thinking about this, that one very important thing, the economy, the American economy, may actually change for the better. And if Barack Obama were to win a second term, he would be able to pursue the things I've been talking about. The long-term task of outreach and engagement, pushing back extremism, because those things can only be long-term tasks. Let me be clear, the challenges he faces are truly daunting. But in my view, the framework he set out in those speeches I mentioned, from the inaugural speech, the beginning of last year, to the Jakarta speech of just a few days ago, that framework is surely the right one. And if we think, this is where I challenge you, if we think the strategy is right, we have a responsibility to make it work. This is about citizens. This is about living together. This is about all those fine words which are actually very, very important. Even if we get tired of them, we have to put back meaning into them if the meaning's been drained away. It's about tolerance and multiculturalism. All our societies now are multicultural. The question that remains is not whether they will be multicultural, but what we do about it, how we make our societies work. Keeping hope alive, a very American thing. More American, believe me, than a European thing. Keeping hope alive in a multicultural world is not just the work of Barack Obama. It's our job too. Thank you very much.
My friend and colleague Roger, I think, was too charitable toward both the Obama administration and the enormity of the challenge that the United States is facing when it comes to the Middle East or the Muslim world in general. I think we can all acknowledge that presently the relation between the United States and the Muslim world is a troubled one. I want to try to address this troubled relationship in two parts. Part one, to talk about what are some of the historical underlying causes of these problems, that it is more than just an issue of misunderstanding. Sorry to disappoint many of the well-meaning but rather naive folks who might be in the audience. Secondly, to say that even though as one who voted for President Obama, I think it is time to see beyond the limitations of his lofty rhetoric and his timid policies to point out that this type of Band-Aid is not going to solve the wounds, existing wounds in the relationship between these two constituencies. So let me first start by making some general remarks. I want to once again emphasize the fact that we need to keep in mind that there is no such thing as Islam. In my view, there are Islams. It's a plural thing. Islam has stood behind conservatism and revolution, peace and war, tolerance and bigotry. The same way those who argue Islam is a religion of peace, in my view, are again, have a noble thing in mind but are historically absolutely wrong. The same way those who feel that there is no element of tolerance in this religion, I don't think have done their homework. So that's number one. We are talking about Islams, plural. Furthermore, we are talking about a set of more than 70 different countries. Okay? As Roger pointed out, 1.6 billion people. There is no way that one can put this group of people into a monolithic and homogeneous group, right? And the world of Islam is as divided as the world of, as the one in the West. Many races, many cultures, many nationalities, languages, regions, and the like. My point, however, is not to make these, which would be sort of sophomoric arguments in a social studies class, but to move on and say the following. The process of globalization, as we have it right now, and by globalization I mean globalization of capitalism, modernity, the nation-state system. has basically threatened, challenged way too many identities and attachments around the globe, be it in the Muslim world, be it in the third world in general. Many people in the non-Western world now realize that the process of globalization has basically problematized or pierced the type of life words that they used to hang on to, right? And therefore, I want to suggest that underlying much of the contest that goes on right now is this larger issue beyond a simple issue of, U.S. policy in country X and Y. There is something more gigantic here at the stake. Social scientists who work on issues of globalization and modernity have all been reminding us that in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, global modernity is basically elevating this issue of who or what directs or delimits the identities of individuals, countries, regions, cultures, and the like, right? And what we have seen, again, thanks to this paradoxical nature of modernization and globalization, is the fact that these phenomena also creates a space for an oppositional discourse, right, to manifest itself, to gather momentum, to recruit foot soldiers, and so forth. That's what we see right now. When I look at the Muslim world nowadays, I see a community that is becoming increasingly self-conscious and assertive. I want to remind you, now that we look back, it was only a few years ago, right? 10 years or so, that we were told by Francis Fukuyama that history has come to an end. Western capitalism has won. There is only one game in town, and that's Western liberalism, right? Notice nowadays how shallow that argument looks to us a mere 10 years after it was made. There is time for different ways of looking at things. I always have this conversation with my leftist colleagues who in 2010 continue talking about U.S. imperialism as if this is the same imperialism or colonial power that was enjoying a great deal of power and prestige in the 1960s or 1970s. When I look at the United States right now as the only remaining superpower, I see a failing empire. An empire that fails miserably in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and anywhere else it ventures to go nowadays, despite having, as Roger nicely points out in his book, over 400 military facilities in the Middle East alone. So this is not the same Godzilla, right, that people used to imagine the United States. Things has changed. Ironically, however, still, this is the same power that, despite its tormented status, is much needed in terms of bringing to a conclusion such intractable conflicts as the Arab-Israeli conflict. In his book, Roger talks, I think, very, very nicely. He proposes the following argument. He says that jihadist strategy is a powerful narrative that is based on three types of principles, right? Three types of sub-narratives. One, the narrative of humiliation, of what he calls having to live under autocratic regimes and suffering from underdevelopment. My friend Rami Houri of American University of Beirut has put a different term for it. He has called it the deficit of dignity and deficit of development. These are two huge deficits that the Muslim world is certainly suffering from. Therefore, to all those who look for the causes of Islamic revival in this verse or that verse of the Quran and want to engage in a hermeneutical reading to understand why we have the Islamic revival, I say, you got it wrong, friend. Islam has a lot to do with social, historical, and economic factors rather than theological and matters of jurisprudence. If the local citizenry views their ruling elites as nothing but American puppets, therefore the logic is, why should I limit my criticism and fight against the puppet and not the puppet master? As long as you are viewed as the puppet master, there is no such thing as hitting below the belt in their viewpoint. Number two, he talks about the power of globalized imagery, right? That for too long, whether the Bush administration or now the Obama administration have, convinced themselves that the soft power of Madison Avenue, a better advertisement program, having better PR campaigns, etc., is going to change the equation or the nature of perception of the U.S. and the Muslim world. I'm sorry to say that that's not how it works. First of all, how powerful is this soft power to begin with, right? When the other side can constantly point out the prevalent culture of consumerism, sex, and all those other negative aspects of culture that they see on their side. And thirdly, Roger talks about the legitimizing role of violence. As I was reading his book, it took me back to the ideas of Frantz Fanon, right? And I said, where else have I read this argument that violence is a cleansing force, that violence puts you out of your state of mental subordination? And I remembered, oh yes, it's in The Wretched of the Earth of Frantz Fanon. Fanon, however, was a champion of this sort of radical nationalism or social, combined with socialist ideals. The Islamic jihadists of today are still invoking the argument of violence, but of course with a religious connotation. My point is this. The three sub-narratives that Roger has identified make for a powerful, powerful mix, right? And I think we will be fooling ourselves to think that it is easy to wish any of them away. I don't see any of these three factors, frankly, disappearing anytime from the equation. Now let me turn the last 2 minutes of my time to the Obama administration. As Roger himself pointed out, no one doubts the president's noble wishes to really move away from that toxic legacy that the Bush administration created with the Islamic world, right? But let us look concretely at what he has accomplished above and beyond the mere rhetoric. As I look, what do I see? A president, number one, a president that stopped pushing Israel on the issue of settlement freeze and instead has opted for the good old policy of pleading or bribing Israel. He lost a great deal of support in the Muslim world at that very moment, right? We don't hear a bip anymore about Senator Mitchell and his peace initiative and what he's trying to do in that region. Again, Roger rightfully pointed out the centrality of the Palestinian issue, and I don't think we need to be in a state of denial about what it matters. Number two, rather than initiating tough, serious, painstaking negotiations with Iran, we saw the continuation of the same sanctioned regime, right? President was in South Korea the other day, and the paradox was not lost on me when he was calling for making the Korean Peninsula a nuclear-free zone, right? This same president is reluctant to ask or advocate the same policy of a nuclear-free Middle East. People in that region are not dumb not to recognize the inconsistency of what the right hand is doing and what the left hand is doing. That's number two. Number three, not closing the Guantanamo Bay. Again, I'm baffled by all the talk about public diplomacy and its significance, etc., how we do not understand how toxic Guantanamo Bay can be, despite the fact that you have put an end to the practice of torture, or at least that's what the claim is. Drone attacks in Pakistan have intensified under President Obama rather than go down. Support for Hamid Karzai's corrupt regime has continued rather than stopped. Support for other autocratic regimes in the region has continued. Huge arms sales have gone on, and so forth and so on. So, do we not have the right to say, enough of the lofty rhetoric, where is the meat, as that wonderful Wendy's advertisement used to say? Where is the meat? I'm not holding my breath that the Obama will undertake meaningful yet politically costly foreign policy actions in the remainder of his term, or even if he's reelected, right? He's dealing with a hostile Congress. And more than that, he is facing with the phenomena of what I call two Americas. This is a divided polity, folks. And the elections of last week, I think, demonstrated in the best possible fashion. We have a citizenry that is totally absorbed with its internal, largely economic problems, and couldn't care less about the challenges of foreign policy and what it means in other regions. The legacy of these two Americas are going to hinder the president's and tie his hands in the years to come. Finally, I have one other concern. The Bush administration came to office not expecting 9/11, not expecting the war between Israel and Hezbollah, not expecting the war between Israel and Gaza, with Hamas in Gaza, and all of those happened on his watch. This is not a region of the world that is going to remain silent. Problems are going to present itself. And so far, at least, again, as a critic, I have not seen enough to convince me that this administration has put itself in a proper position to handle the crises that are bound to come in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll be brief. I have, I think, one, I do wish to make a plug for Roger's book because I think it's just really fine, succinct treatment of the issues written in an approachable way, and I found it very lucid and enjoyed the opportunity to take a look. I thought I would just comment briefly about this concept of multiple Islams. I think it's an apt conception, but I can't also pass up the opportunity to say something about the Obama administration. You've served it up on a platter, Roger, and I'll say one or two things. The Islam's point, I think, brings to mind a story that I heard really just last week myself for the first time about the very devout Muslim who went very hurriedly in to see his imam and said to the imam, you know, I was at home yesterday and my door was open and I did not know it, and in came a dog, and before I could stop him, the dog ran to the corner of my room where I pray, and he peed on the wall. What should I do? And the imam said to the devout Muslim, well, the only thing that you can do under those circumstances is to tear down the wall. The man said, well, that's the problem, Imam. That's the wall that's common between my house and your house. Well, in that case, said the Imam, I think if you splash a little water on the spot, everything will be just fine. Now, there are many answers to questions in Islam, just as there are to questions in other faiths and other political regimens around the world. And I think it is fair to say, from the perspective of a lawyer, that it might be that legal Islam could have something to say about Islamism. There's a powerful resonance between Islamic law and humanitarian principles, between Islamic law and the absolute protection of civilians in a time of conflict. We all know that those principles are not well followed in the portions of the world where most of the armed conflicts are ongoing at this time, which happen to be in Muslim majority states. The West does not necessarily follow those principles terribly well, but neither does the other side, whatever the other side happens to be. So I think one idea that I'd like to posit, I didn't get mentioned in Roger's presentation today, although I think it's implicit in his book, is that Islam is a powerful force for good in countering Islamism. And I think that's true of legal Islam as well as the Sharia, the Ummah, the interpretations of the Imam and custom. It's good stuff and it's powerful. I think the West, including, as Roger phrases it, the United States can work productively with Muslim majority states to incorporate Islam-based solutions to the most horrific problems of managing conflict in conflict-riven areas. It's an idea that I think has a potential for success, some success. Second area, the Obama administration and its policies. I certainly agree with the themes that both Roger and Mirjad addressed between the disparities between rhetoric and policy, or between imagery and policy. The Obama administration certainly changed the music in countering terrorism. It's not a global war on terrorism anymore. He did make those bold commitments in the first days of office, as Roger recounted them, about closing Gitmo, about ending the practice of torture, and so on. Very high-minded, very bold, very well received virtually everywhere. But there are problems. The policies haven't followed the rhetoric or matched the imagery. When Roger said that he ended torture, well, he didn't. In terms of policy, the Bush administration ended torture a couple of years before the end of the Bush's second term. But lawyers who look carefully will recognize that what was banned was an open-ended concept of torture without further elaboration. What's that mean? We now have rules on the books that forbid torture without further elaboration. What does that mean? It's also true, as Roger says, that Guantanamo now is a model detention facility. But that doesn't mean that we, the West, or others aren't engaged in abuses of detainees at other settings around the world, including in Afghanistan, or in Pakistan, or in Yemen, or in other parts of the world. Some of the other policies, I think the Gitmo decision was naive. It solved some immediate image problems, but it's been far more difficult to implement than the president could have imagined at the time. And as you all know, attendant to the problem of closing the facility itself has been figuring out what to do with those who are there. And in the longer term, if this president does get a second term, he's got somewhere between 4 dozen and 5 dozen detainees at Guantanamo Bay that he can't send home because there isn't home, or home won't take them, that he can't try because of abusive interrogation so that the confessions that would be used would be disallowed in a court. And he has to have, for the first time in the history of the United States, a system of civilian detention without trial. Now, in addition to those, Roger mentioned the area of torture once again. One thing the Obama administration has not supported that I think would go a long way toward remediating bad feelings in some parts of the world is to bring those who are responsible for ordering the torture during the Bush administration to accountability for their actions. This president has said, no, I don't wish to bring those individuals to justice, whatever that might be. That's questionable judgment, it seems to me. Politically, it may be the appropriate one here in the United States, but I'm not sure it's the best judgment in light of these big principles. Finally, let me just touch on the 3 principles that Roger suggested at the end. I thought those were great and high-minded and useful, except that I think the point about consistency, point number 1, it won't work in this realm of foreign affairs. The world, I think, is too messy. The problems are too complicated. And expecting consistency in an absence of hypocrisy is just wishing for too much. I think we're going to have to live with it. And I wish that he had emphasized his second principle even more, because I think what the United States can do, because of our material wealth, our resources, is to strive toward ending illiteracy and poverty in the regions of the world where we've done harm as well as good. That part of counterinsurgency strategy is high-minded and promises to go a long way, I think, for the United States. And if we underfed the military option and overfed those aspects of counterinsurgency, I think we'd be much better off. I agree with the no occupation point, but how are you going to do it? How are you going to get out of Afghanistan? Are you going to walk out? Are you going to leave this year? I don't care which president we would have elected in 2008 or which one we elect next time. Some of you listened to George Packer when he was here a few weeks ago, talking about the tragedy of the Afghanistan war. It may be Barack Obama's Vietnam. I don't know how you walk away from that quagmire at this particular point in time. I agree that Iraq was a mistake. It also, just as a footnote, happened to be unlawful to fight that war in Iraq. Not that that's terribly important. Why don't I pause right there? Thanks very much.
Roger, with your indulgence, I would like to move to questions. I know that there were tons of things there you want to respond to, but I also want to make sure that we get plenty of time for folks to ask things that they want to ask. So go ahead, sir.
Greeting, Mr. Harding. My name is Jeffrey Pella. I'm an alumni here at Maxwell School and currently pursuing a third advanced degree in There we go. Sorry. In economics. I would first like to thank you for, and the rest of the panel for that matter, for extending us here at Syracuse University the courtesy of your time. That said, my question deals with the details integral to the efficacy of any soft power, that is to say, political engagement approaches significantly depend upon. What strategies might be adopted to resolve the challenges posed by implementing political engagement approaches toward dishonest and hostile state actors such as Iran or those residing in the West Bank or Gaza? Additionally, how do we ensure said political engagement approaches are insulated against being co-opted by adversaries of the United States, co-opted diplomatic efforts, which can then be used as a facilitative platform to further terrorist goals in the battle of the narrative, or as a form of calculated aggression affording adversaries of the United States time to further their relative strength? Examples, of course, being the Iranian nuclear program or solidified centers of gravity, such as the proxies engaged against the United States in Iraq.
Well, that's a challenge. Look, engagement is a means, not an end. And I sometimes think the Obama people tend to think sometimes that it's an end. They tick the box. You ask them, what have you done? They say, well, we made a big speech. You say, well, fine. But then what? If I'm right, and it's a means, not an end, it's a means to different ends. You try to engage with Iran because you think that's a more sensible way than bombing them to try to ideally halt them from a nuclear program that most of the world, a militarized nuclear program that the world does not want to see, and that's in danger of creating, and is already beginning to create, a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. With Hamas, nobody's engaging with Hamas. So the policy with Hamas is you squeeze them and starve them and hope they'll go away, and it won't work. I won't mention a lot of hostile actors, as you put it, but I will mention Ryan Crocker again. A couple of months back, he said the United States should be talking to Hezbollah.
Ryan Crocker said that?
Ryan Crocker said that.
Well.
You can find it on Google. And the administration said, no, we're not going to talk to Hezbollah. For those of you who follow Lebanon, Lebanon is in bad shape right now. If a dialogue with Hezbollah, you can't start it today and solve Lebanon's problems, but if there'd been one a couple of years back that continued, a critical dialogue. Dialogue is not unconditional. Dialogue doesn't mean I love you. George Bush used to say wrongly, talking to someone legitimizes them. Absolutely wrong. Talk to any professional diplomat. You talk to someone to try to have some, not only contact, some degree of leverage, some degree of influence, however tiny, on what they do. And at the very least, you're telling them that you disapprove of this, or you want this and you don't want that. It's a channel at the very least, even if you don't get what you want, which in many cases is correct. So engagement is a means, not an end. Can it be hijacked for evil purposes? I think that was George Bush's fear. I don't see it that way. It has to be intelligent engagement, and it's different every time. It's never a one-size-fits-all.
You know how you were talking about not invading other countries, and I don't think anybody here or in the world has anything against Muslims at all. But you have to remember, the United States is more than happy to sit down with just about any country in the world and talk about problems. But when we're attacked, you really expect us not to retaliate against a country? They came and attacked us. And that's what we're going to do, is we're going to go over there and invade their country. They brought this on us. They could have came and talked to us. And then you want to tell me about how, we shouldn't invade a country that attacked us when you say dialogue is what we should be engaging in? Their dialogue was a plane slamming into a building.
There's only one thing wrong with what you say. No state attacked you. Al-Qaeda is not a state. Now, as I said in my remarks, going to Afghanistan was at least understandable. The United States had the support of a very large part of the world. Of course, many Muslims were not happy, but there was a considerable amount of support because the attack had come from there. Al-Qaeda is a kind of NGO, a very weird, dangerous, nasty, violent NGO with which you cannot negotiate. There is no possible negotiating position with Al-Qaeda. There's nothing that they want that we can give, and nothing that we can give that they want, That means there's no meeting of minds. No country attacked you. To be attacked by this group, this curious, globalized form of radical Islam, and to lash out attacking countries that either you don't like or you think are linked with them, frankly, that's what was attempted. We were told that Saddam Hussein had something to do with them. He didn't. Some people say Iran has something to do with them. On the whole, it doesn't. It's true there are some Al-Qaeda guys who've taken refuge in Iran, and the Iranians very cleverly are using them as pawns in some future game. This is the problem we have. So my challenge to you is, who is the them? They attacked us. Yeah, they're not states. Al-Qaeda, which is now a globalized force, but please don't say Islam attacked us on 9/11, because do you really want Samuel Huntington's War of Civilizations? Is that what we want? If that's the case, first of all, we better pull up the drawbridges and hide in our bunkers, because that's terrible. I'm going a little bit further than your question. This is not World War III, as some people say. It really is not World War III. It's a serious and difficult problem, but this is not like the massive international crises, the two world wars of the 20th century. It's something totally different. And one of our mistakes, my country, your country, many other countries, it was put wonderfully by a guy I'd never heard of who wrote a brilliant piece in the Washington Post a while back, talking about bin Laden and he said, and the rest, he said, these are small men made large by our fears. That's what I think. You have to have guts to say that. This is not what people are used to hearing. I think he's right, which does not mean it's not a problem, but we've got to get a grip on what the problem is and what it is not. Invading places will not crack a shadowy organization that's kind of here, there, and everywhere and nowhere. You see what I mean?
One of the things that was mentioned, and I think maybe related to the question that was just asked, is that you spoke about multiple Islams as an Islams. From my understanding, Islam is one. There is just one Islam. There is one God. There is one book, and there is one prophet. There are different countries that follow Islam, and we can say even that they are Muslim countries. So when the question was asked, they attacked us on 9/11, and even no Muslims attacked, and it was answered quite well that there is not one country that attacked. The problem that I see is that we have, even the discussion that we have, it's Islam and the West. So we are putting Islam against the West. Islam has a problem. The problem that Islam has with the West is the same that it has a problem with the East. It's not East or West. If we put our dialogue as some countries, we can call them Middle Eastern countries, you can call them XYZ, you can put some countries and the West. Even as it was mentioned before, there is more than one America, even when we have in America. So when we put Islam as against the West, that becomes unintentionally a problem that we're having.
I just wanted to say that when I say there are Islams, it's not the negation of the fact that there is one prophet, one holy book. That refers to the fact that there are multiple interpretations of Islam, right? As we all know, bin Laden's interpretation of what Islam is fundamentally, radically different from how a Sufi Muslim understands Islam, right? From how, a peaceful, Sunni in Indonesia or, a Shiite in Iran might be interpreting Islam. So we are talking about different interpretations. Islam, just like any other religion, has been divided into multiple branches. Last time I checked, there were 70 different sects within Islam, right? 70. So we are not talking about one single Islam. There are, multiple Islams. But you're absolutely right. I mean, what do we get by this type of, false polarity, right, between Islam and the West? In his book, Roger, I think, rightfully points out the irony that, we in the West went and replaced Islam with communism as the new enemy in town, right? That became the major other against which the West was now, fighting. But as in the context of the answer to the previous question, he makes a very important point. The point is, when you were fighting the communists, you were fighting governments, and then the people in those countries, right, were your target. You wanted to win them over. The argument here now is the opposite, that you are trying to appeal to a group of people who might have sympathies for the type of discourse that Al-Qaeda or these more radical types are embracing. So the conflict can be ideological, but the nature of it has changed a bit. And we need to come to terms with this new reality.
Let me just add that I'm not comfortable talking about Islam and the West. I touched on it very briefly because I felt I had to, but I didn't want to spend 10 minutes on it in my remarks. At least one Muslim reviewer took issue with the book on the grounds that whether wittingly or not, you're positing an us and them, and this is bad, and in the end you become a Huntingtonian even against your will. I'm aware of the dangers. In a globalized world, there is not an Islam and a West. As I put it in the book, each now inhabits the world of the other. But, so why do I use the term? Because I come back and back. I'm a journalist, I'm in the simplification business. If you're talking about a bundle of issues that include wars and conflicts, many of which I mentioned, and things I didn't mention, the culture wars, as we call them in Europe, not quite the same thing as you mean here. The headscarf wars we've had, the cartoon wars we've had, even at one point, God help us, a teddy bear war we had. You may not have followed this one. But all these things, whether we like it or not, have a polarizing effect. I would wish that it was not so. The cartoon affair is the classic example I give. I almost wrote the book because of the cartoon affair. It may seem very strange to you. It depressed me very deeply because this was not state to state, government to government. If this was a problem between Denmark and Saudi Arabia, they would have sorted it out in about a month max. It was a grassroots issue by two groups of people. And I'm sorry, one group is Muslim, and predominantly Muslim, and the other is predominantly non-Muslim. We can't get away from it. I would wish that we could, but we can't. And each group adamantly believed that they occupied the moral high ground. It doesn't get any worse. And because it was a grassroots conflict at root, the governments couldn't handle it. If you do read the book, the chapter on Europe begins with this. I went to a meeting where diplomats from all these countries in Europe, countries in the Muslim world, were as close to utter despair as I have ever seen in my working life. It was an off-the-record meeting. Their despair was, unbridled, because they'd said journalists will not report, will not attribute any remark to the person who made it. They kind of thought all is lost because they didn't know how to, as governments, to get a grip on what had become a popular thing, a media thing, a people-to-people thing. I'm not saying that the problems between, let's say, in inverted commas, if you will, Islam and the West, are the cartoon affair writ large. If we ever reach that point, that would mean we've reached a terrible, terrible point. We haven't got there yet. I don't think that we will get there. But every one of those crises has the effect of driving people into two camps. It doesn't matter whether they're comfortable being there or they want to be there. These crises push people. And then if we're lucky, if the crisis goes away, people remember then their common humanity, mutual respect and mutual interest. For mutual respect and mutual interest to work, the situation requires a certain level of calm or a certain level of tension which is almost never applies. It's a lot. I promised you a brief answer and gave you a long one. I do not know if that makes sense to you. It's the possibly bad reason why I still use this shorthand, as I call it. But I always try to contextualize it as far as I can when I use these terms.
Since the United States began to engage with the world in the late 19th century, while this is an oversimplification, I think we've had two basic ways of regarding the world and our engagement in it in our popular culture. One is we either wish to ignore it completely, which you spoke to earlier, or we wish to go save it, as in World War I, World War II, or in Iraq in George Bush's imagination, perhaps. I think we're at a point where, having failed to save the world in this case, we wish to ignore it again. We really do want to look in and try to solve our own problems, especially in an economy which seems to be incapable of giving people jobs anymore and serving our needs anymore. We don't want to be tasked anymore with fighting these wars. And Obama's engagement in the rest of the world, his position as a multicultural person, a person who's more foreign, maybe, than we wish him to be, only reinforces ridiculous ideas about him, like he's a Muslim or he wasn't born in the U.S. It also doesn't let him serve America in the way it wishes to be served.
I think you've raised something that's really very important. Insofar as I can read Barack Obama, and he's not that easy to read in my view. In some ways you see the picture, you think you know him. I think he's quite a mysterious person in a way. But insofar as I can read him, I think he wants to move to a kind of middle position. And he could only achieve that, and I think he knows it, by somehow disengaging from Iraq. Maybe in a second term, if he got one. Don't believe this stuff about 2011. It's meaningless now. They're not talking about 2011, and I think it was a clear mistake by this administration. I'm sending in the way he did the speech. I was just astonished. I'm sending in an extra 30,000 troops. And by the
Afghanistan, not
to
Iraq.
Afghanistan, I'm talking about Afghanistan. And by the way, they're going to start withdrawing at a date in 2011. And everybody around him, especially the military, have been kind of rowing back from this ever since. The date they're now talking about in my country and in yours is 2014. But the damage was done in a sense. He said that. But let me go back to what I think, because your question is a very big and general question. I think he would like to find a way of withdrawing from Afghanistan with some degree of dignity and some semblance of having achieved something, just as he's trying to do in Iraq. I don't think either of those is easy. The Iraq story is not over, repeat, not over, even if US combat troops are not there fighting. To do what you were invoking, to shift to isolationism would be terrible. And let me just say that it would be terrible from the rest of the world's point of view. Madeleine Albright described America as the indispensable nation. You may have thought I made some somewhat critical remarks about your foreign policy, both under Bush and under Obama. I do. But I think you are the indispensable nation. And I think the world considers that for various reasons, and not just because you can spread money around, believe me. I think you've raised a very big question. If somehow America can shift to a position that is neither the new empire, is not hegemonic, as you scholars like to say, or isolationist, which I think would be an absolutely terrible thing for you guys and the world. But the difficulty, given your economic situation, of finding that position where you are playing a global role, but you're not a new empire, you're not the new Rome. And I really don't believe that the American people want to be or to be seen as being the new imperial power on the block.
Hi. I was listening to the BBC World Service, I think maybe a year ago. You guys are great. But I remember a story about how they were talking about Hamas and about public opinion regarding Hamas, and saying that technically a lot of the people there believed that they served their interests pretty effectively. And I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am. But I feel that when we go in and we destabilize a region, sometimes like an organization will fill the void of power, and it'll provide some structure, and so people are attracted to that. Not necessarily because they hate the West, but because there's nothing else to really hold on to. So I guess my question to you is, these organizations that we are fighting in our war on terror, quote unquote, how are they regarded in the area?
I think the short answer to you would be we have to look at the role these groups play within their society. And my answer is they fulfill some kind of social need. They would not exist if they did not fill some sort of social need, and they would not have achieved the level of influence and power they have. For example, you mentioned Hamas, but the even more powerful group, Hezbollah in Lebanon. If they did not fill some sort of social need that is not being fulfilled by anybody else, usually the state, the central government. This doesn't make it easy for us to deal with them, but it seems to me necessary to deal with them, partly because this is the only way we can try to begin to help to solve the local problem in the Israeli-Palestinian arena or in the Lebanese arena or some other arena. And partly because they are the mainstream. I call them the Islamo-nationalists. Okay, many people think this now, that religion has become the new nationalism, and there is a very strong nationalism working away there. This makes them distinct from the Islamo-internationalists, the revolutionaries, meaning Al-Qaeda and groups of the Al-Qaeda type, with whom, as I mentioned before, no negotiation is possible. Some negotiation with Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups is possible. Not easy, but possible to try, because their cause is a local cause. There are very specific things they want, not easy for us to give or for our allies to give, but possible, theoretically possible. In my country, we dealt with the IRA. considered a terrorist group, and various governments vowed never to negotiate with the terrorist group. And some of the ones who were vowing it were at the same moment quietly negotiating with them. The IRA, in the end, was focused on a particular piece of turf and a particular set of grievances linked to that particular turf. They were not in the business of global terrorism or global violence or exporting their revolution or anything of this kind. It was not easy to deal with them, but the British government, with help, and I applaud him, from Bill Clinton, helped to resolve that problem. I would use exactly the same principles with the groups I've mentioned in the Middle East.
Goes to Robert Pape's argument about occupation.
Yes. Occupation is the burning issue for these people. Doesn't mean there are not other things going on, that there isn't this ideology. I'm so glad, as I mentioned, this cocktail from the book. You did a better job of promoting the book than I did. But the cocktail of grievances is in many ways internal to the Muslim world. And it was that part that I quite consciously left out, in a sense. The painful path to modernity in most of the Muslim world is also at the heart of this. And while we are implicated in that, because globalization is an American-led process, we can't be held, we meaning America or we meaning the West, we're not to blame for every damn thing that goes wrong in the Muslim world. For some of them, yes, partly because we prop up the government that does these things. Take Iraq. What a dysfunctional political class. But your country and mine helped to put in power this dysfunctional class, which is not only politically dysfunctional, it's deeply corrupt. We can't wash our hands of it. And yet, they're moving towards some sort of autonomous life now. In other words, they will be responsible for their own mistakes, and may God help them. It's very tricky to get a balance of reasons that doesn't either blame Islam for being, what was the T-shirt? Islam is the work of the devil. So that's it, is it? So Islam is the work of the devil and that explains everything? I'm sorry. Or to say the West is the work of the devil and the evil imperialistic West is responsible. These are the two twin dangers. I hope I haven't gone there. But many people go to either one of them, and they're dangerous people.
We have a reception that is waiting for us. Before we end, though, I just want to remind you that I know that there are a lot of questions that have not been asked yet. Take that time out in the hall to seek out our three speakers and talk to them. And finally, I just want to say we've heard some spirited debate, some spirited agreement, and civil discourse from the three of you and from the audience. So thanks to the three of you for that.